The Northern Territory of Australia, 1984. If you look at a map of the world, this region looks like a frayed edge of the continent, dissolving into the Arafura Sea. But if you are on the ground, standing in the thick, suffocating mud of the mangroves, maps become irrelevant. This is a primordial labyrinth, a place where the distinction between land and water is fluid, changing with the violent tides that rush in and out twice a day. It is a world of sensory overload. The air is heavy with the smell of salt, rotting vegetation, and sulfur. The heat is a physical weight, pressing down on you with a humidity that makes every breath feel like you are inhaling water, and the silence is a lie. The mangroves are never truly silent. They are alive with the sounds of insects, the splash of mud skippers, and the cracking of roots. But there is one sound that stops all others. It is a low-frequency vibration, more felt in the chest than heard with the ears. It is the sound of an apex predator displacing water without breaking the surface. In this hostile environment, evolution has forged the perfect killing machine, the saltwater crocodile, Crocodilus porosus. They are the largest living reptiles on Earth, survivors of the epoch that killed the dinosaurs. They are patient, they are powerful, and, as the locals will tell you, they are watching. Most encounters with these creatures are brutal, but simple. A mistake is made near the water's edge, a snap of jaws, a death roll, and silence. It is nature, red in tooth and claw. But what happens when the predator doesn't just act on instinct? What happens when the biological machine begins to learn, to calculate, and to plan? Tonight, we are going to tell you a story that has been whispered in the fishing pubs of Darwin for 40 years. It is the story of a creature the locals named Baron. He was not just a monster in size, measuring over 23 feet, a true giant of his species. He was a monster in mind. The elders of the local tribes warned that Baron was different. They said he had a memory. They said he understood the mechanics of the boats that invaded his river. The year was 1984. It is important to remember the context. There were no satellite phones in the bush, no GPS locators, no drones to fly overhead and spot danger. If you went into the deep mangroves, you were severing your connection to the modern world. You were stepping back into the Carboniferous period. If you screamed, the only thing that would hear you were the bats and the mosquitoes. In October of that year, a team of 4 dedicated researchers set out to document the ecosystem of the Adelaide River Delta. They were rational men and women, scientists. They believed in data, in biology, in the predictable laws of nature. They laughed off the stories of the giant crocodile with the white scar across his snout. To them, Baron was just a statistical outlier, a big specimen, nothing more. They headed for Station 4, a remote observation shack built on stilts deep within the tidal zone. It was supposed to be a routine 3-day survey. It became a siege. Before we enter the dark water with them, I want to ask you a question of survival psychology. Imagine you are trapped in a wooden shack, miles from civilization. The storm is raging outside. The water is rising, inch by inch, coming up through the floorboards. You know that somewhere in that black water, a 7-meter reptile is waiting. You have a choice. Do you jump into the water and try to swim for the distant shore, hoping you are faster than him? Or do you stay in the collapsing house, hoping the water stops rising before the roof does? What is your breaking point? Tell me in the comments below what you would do. Would you swim, or would you wait? The story of Station 4 is not just a story of an animal attack. It is a locked room mystery where the room is sinking. When the rescue team finally arrived days later, they found a scene of devastation. The shack was half destroyed, the equipment was gone, but the most chilling piece of evidence was not what was broken, But what was cut? The research boat hadn't drifted away by accident. The heavy rope tethering it had been chewed through. The beast hadn't just attacked them, he had disarmed them. October 12, 1984. The Adelaide River Delta. The sun hung low and heavy over the Arafura Sea, a burning orb of pale orange that offered no warmth, only a suffocating, radioactive heat. To understand the nightmare that was about to unfold, you must first understand the geography of the trap. The delta is not solid ground. It is a biological soup, 1,000 square miles of silt, black water, and twisted mangrove roots that look like the arthritic fingers of giants clawing at the mud. It is a place where the map is rewritten every 6 hours by the violent tides of the Northern Territory. When the tide is out, it is a vast, stinking mudflat. When the tide is in, the ocean swallows the land whole, turning the forest into a dark, submerged kingdom. Into this hostile labyrinth motored a small, battered aluminum vessel, the Darwin Star. On board were 4 people who believed they were the masters of their domain. Leading the expedition was Dr. Elias Thorne, a herpetologist from the University of Sydney, a man whose beard was graying and whose skin was leathery from decades of field work. With him were his 2 graduate students, Sarah and Miller, eager, young, and weighed down with heavy film cameras and notebooks. Piloting the boat was a local guide named Jack Mac McAllister, a man who smoked hand-rolled cigarettes and looked at the river with a mixture of respect and paranoia. Their destination was Station 4, a grandiose name for what was essentially a wooden box on stilts, built by a mining company in the 1960s and abandoned shortly after. It sat 3 miles up a narrow tributary known as Saltwater Creek. The structure was elevated, 20 feet off the mud on ironwood pylons, designed to stay dry even during the chaotic king tides. It was isolated, it was rotting, and on this particular afternoon, it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a cage waiting for its occupants. The journey upriver was slow. The engine of the Darwin Star fought against the thick, brown current. The heat was absolute. In 1984, the Northern Territory was suffering through a pre-monsoon heat wave. The air temperature hovered near 40 degrees Celsius, but the humidity pushed it higher. Sweat didn't evaporate. It just pooled on the skin. The air smelled of sulfur and brine, the scent of 1,000,000 decaying leaves trapped in the mud. As they moved deeper into the mangroves, the sky began to change. The relentless blue was being bruised by towering anvils of cumulonimbus clouds gathering in the north. The build-up, as the locals called it, the tension in the atmosphere before the rains broke. Dr. Thorne was not concerned with the weather. He was concerned with data. He was here to prove a theory about the migration patterns of saltwater crocodiles. He believed the populations were recovering faster than the government admitted. He was looking for numbers. He was looking for biology. He was not looking for a legend. But legends have a way of finding you in the bush. Mac, the guide, kept the boat in the center of the channel. He knew these waters. He knew that the seemingly empty surface was a deception. "Keep your arms inside the gunwales," Mac warned, his voice raspy. Sarah laughed, adjusting the lens of her camera. She pointed to a log floating 50 yards off the port bow. "I want to get a shot of that driftwood," she said. Mac didn't laugh. He cut the engine. The silence that rushed in to fill the void of the motor was deafening. The buzzing of cicadas, the whine of mosquitoes, the drip of water. "That's not wood, love," Mac said softly. The log shifted. It didn't bob in the current. It rotated. Slowly, imperceptibly at first. The object turned against the flow of the river. A heavy armored ridge broke the surface. Then a tail thick as a tree trunk sculled the water with a single lazy motion. It was immense even from 50 yards away. The scale of the animal was wrong. It was too wide across the shoulders. The color was a dark, slate gray, almost black, covered in algae and scars. And then the head appeared. It was a block of prehistoric bone, battered and ancient. Across the snout, a jagged line of white scar tissue stood out against the dark scales. The mark of a propeller blade or a tribal spear from decades ago. Baron, Mac whispered. The name slipped out like a curse. The crocodile didn't submerge. He floated there watching them. In the animal kingdom, eye contact is usually fleeting. Prey looks away. Predators assess. But this animal held its gaze. He was looking at the boat. He was looking at the engine. Thorn grabbed his binoculars. Magnificent, he muttered. Must be over 20 feet. A dominant male, probably territory holding. Thorn saw a specimen. Mac saw something else. He saw a creature that wasn't afraid of the noise of the engine. Crocodiles usually sink when approached. This one was challenging them. It was an act of arrogance. He's too big for this creek, Miller noted, scribbling furiously in his waterproof notebook. Why is he this far up? Usually the big bulls stay in the main river channel. He goes where he wants, Mac replied, restarting the engine. The roar of the outboard shattered the steering contest. The giant reptile didn't flinch. He simply sank, vertically, like a submarine venting its ballast tanks. He didn't splash. He didn't thrash. He just dissolved into the brown water. One moment he was there, a ton of muscle and teeth. The next, there was only a ring of ripples expanding towards the mangroves. They continued to the station. The mood on the boat shifted. The excitement of the students was palpable. They had just seen a monster on day one, but Mac was uneasy. He kept glancing at the depth sounder, watching the dark line of the bottom. He knew stories about Baron that he hadn't told the scientists. Stories of fishermen's dinghies found empty. Stories of dogs snatched from verandas. The locals said the Baron was older than the mining camp. They said he had learned the rhythm of the tides better than any captain. They arrived at Station 4 just as the light began to fail. The shack stood stark and lonely against the wall of mangrove. It was a rough structure, bleached gray by the sun, with a corrugated iron roof that was rusting at the edges. A wooden walkway connected the shack to a small rickety jetty, where they tied the boat. The tide was low, revealing the slime-covered pylons that held the house up. Underneath the shack, the mud was thick and black, littered with old crab traps and debris. As they unloaded the gear crates of canned food, fresh water, batteries and sleeping rolls, the heat finally broke. A gust of cold wind ripped through the channel, shaking the mangrove leaves. The sky turned a violent shade of purple. Thunder rumbled, low and continuous, like stones rolling inside a barrel. The storm was arriving earlier than predicted. Thorn stood on the deck of the station, looking down at the boat. Tie her off tight, Mac, he ordered. We don't want to be swimming home. Mac used a heavy nautical rope, looping it 3 times around the iron cleat on the jetty, and securing it with a double bowline knot. It was a knot that could hold a ship. He tested it, pulling with his full weight. The boat bobbed gently in the slack water. It was secure. It was safe, or so they thought. Inside the shack, the conditions were primitive. One main room, a small kitchen area with a gas stove and a separate room for the radio equipment. The floorboards were wide, jarrah wood planks, with gaps between them large enough to see the mud below. Miller joked that it was natural air conditioning. He dropped a coin, and they watched it fall through the cracks, landing with a soft plop in the mud, 12 feet below. Don't drop your keys, Sarah laughed. They set up their camp lanterns, the hissing white light pushing back the shadows in the corners. They were confident. They were protected by 12 feet of elevation and sturdy ironwood. They opened beers and celebrated the start of the expedition. They talked about the crocodile they had seen. They estimated his weight at 2,000 pounds. They argued about his age. They treated him as a subject, a data point to be analyzed. They didn't know that outside, the water was beginning to turn. The tide was coming in, and it wasn't just a normal tide. The moon was full, creating a king tide, a tidal surge that would push the water level feet higher than usual. And riding that surge, invisible in the darkening water, Something was following the scent of their boat grease. Barron hadn't stayed behind. He had trailed the wake of the Darwin Star for 3 miles, moving silently along the bottom, his belly brushing the silt. He wasn't defending territory, he was hunting, and he had arrived at Station 4 just as the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer the tin roof. By 8 p.m., the world outside Station 4 had ceased to exist. The storm that had been bruising the horizon all afternoon finally broke with the violence of artillery barrage. The rain didn't fall, it was driven horizontally by 40-knot winds, hammering against the corrugated iron walls of the shack, like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry giant. Inside, the noise was deafening. Conversation was impossible without shouting. The cozy atmosphere of the arrival had evaporated, replaced by the damp, nervous energy of people realizing just how flimsy their shelter actually was. Dr. Thorne and the students were distracted by the weather, securing the equipment cases and checking the roof for leaks. But Mac, the guide, was pacing. He sat by the door smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside the mesh window. He couldn't see anything. The night was a solid wall of black water, but he could feel the shift in the station. The floorboards beneath his boots were vibrating slightly differently. The tide was rushing in, and with the storm surge pushing from the ocean, the water was rising faster and higher than the tide charts predict. "I'm going to check the mooring," Mac announced, grabbing a heavy rubberized flashlight. Thorne looked up from his map, dismissing the concern. "I saw you tie that knot, Mac. It would hold an aircraft carrier." "Sit down." "Tides are funny things in a storm, Doc," Mac muttered, pushing open the door. The wind ripped the door from his hand, slamming it against the outer wall. Mac stepped out onto the wooden walkway, instantly soaked to the skin. He shined his beam down towards the jet. The light cut a cone through the driving rain, illuminating the white caps of the turbulent river water. The river had swollen. It was angry, churning with mud and debris. The water level, which had been 12 feet below the deck hours ago, was now dangerously close to the walkway. Mac swung the light towards the iron cleat where he had secured the Darwin Star. He expected to see the aluminum hull bouncing violently in the chop. He expected to hear the metallic clang of the boat hitting the rubber bumpers. He saw nothing. The space next to the jetty was empty, just dark, swirling water. For a second, Mac's brain refused to process the visual data. He assumed the boat had swung around on its line, hidden by the angle of the rain. He leaned over the railing, sweeping the light frantically back and forth. "Hey," he yelled, his voice snatched away by the wind. "Boat." Nothing. The Darwin Star was gone. Panic is a cold sensation. It starts in the stomach and moves to the extremities. Mac felt his hands go numb. Without that boat, they were stranded in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. He ran back into the shack, water streaming off his face. "It's gone," he roared. "The boat is gone." Thorne and the students froze. "What do you mean gone?" Thorne demanded, standing up. "Did it slip the knot?" "I don't tie slip knots, Max." He grabbed a coil of spare rope and ran back out, with the 3 scientists stumbling after him. They crowded onto the small jetty, 4 beams of light piercing the storm. "Look," Miller shouted, pointing to the cleat on the wooden post. The mooring rope was still there. It was tied fast to the iron cleat with Mac's impeccable double bowline, but the rope didn't lead to a boat. It trailed off into the water, slack and useless. Mac grabbed the wet hemp line and began to haul it in. It was light, too light. He pulled up about 6 feet of rope, and then the end came up out of the water. The 4 of them stared at the end of the rope in the harsh glare of the flashlights. It hadn't unraveled. A knot failure leaves a curly, twisted shape. A clean cut from a knife leaves a flat, flush surface. This was neither. The end of the heavy nautical rope was frayed, exploded outward like a blooming flower. The thick fibers were crushed, matted, and soaked in a viscous slime. It looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. Thorne reached out and touched the ruined end. "It rubbed against the pylon," he said, his voice trembling slightly, trying to apply logic to the situation. "The storm, the waves, it chafed against the wood until it snapped." Mac shook his head slowly. He held the rope up to the light. "Chafing takes hours, and it happens on the side of the rope, not the end. Look at this." He pointed to a section of the rope just inches from the break. The fibers were compressed, fused together by immense pressure. There was a pattern, a serrated, triangular pattern stamped into the hemp. "Teeth,"
Sarah whispered. The word hung in the air, heavier than the thunder. Something bit through it. Mac said, his voice devoid of emotion. Something grabbed the line and chewed until it popped. That's impossible, Thorne argued, though his face had gone pale. Crocodiles don't chew rope. They don't understand mechanics. They don't know that cutting a line releases a boat. Maybe this one does, Mac said. He swung his light out towards the river. Or maybe he just wanted to play with it. Either way, we asked. Miller, the youngest of the group, was scanning the horizon with a high-powered spotlight. There, he screamed. I see metal. 100 yards downriver, caught in the beam of light, was the Darwin Star. The boat hadn't drifted out to sea. It had been pushed by the wind and the current onto a mudbank on the opposite side of the channel. It was tilted at a 45-degree angle, stuck in the mangroves. It was tantalizingly close. A strong swimmer could reach it in 5 minutes. We can swim for it, Miller said, adrenaline spiking in his voice. The current isn't too bad in the eddy. If we go now, we can bring it back before the tide rises more. Mac grabbed Miller by the shoulder, his grip like a vice. Look at the water, son. Look closely. They looked down. The water around the pylons of their shack was black and oily, but every few seconds the surface tension broke. A swirl here, a bubble there. It wasn't just the current. Something massive was moving underneath their feet, navigating the maze of wooden stilts that held them up. He didn't just cut the rope and leave, Mac said softly. He's patrolling. Thorne shone his light down onto one of the main support beams of the jetty. The beam was covered in barnacles and green slime, but about 3 feet above the current waterline, there was a fresh mark, a deep gouged scratch in the hard ironwood, exposing the red timber underneath. It was a claw mark. He was measuring, Mac said, realizing the horror of the situation. Before the tide rose, he was up here. He was testing the height of the walkway. A sudden violent thud shook the entire jetty. The impact came from below, striking the floorboards, right under Sarah's feet. She screamed and jumped back. The wood groaned but held. It wasn't a wave. Something solid, something possessing the kinetic energy of a battering ram, had just head-butted the underside of the dock. Get inside, Mac ordered, drawing the flare gun from his belt. Everyone inside. Now. They scrambled back into the shack and slammed the heavy wooden door, bolting it shut. The sound of the storm was muffled, but the feeling of safety was gone. They were no longer observers in a research station. They were trapped in a wooden box, suspended over a rising ocean, with a creature that had effectively confiscated their only set of keys. Mac went to the window and looked out at the boat, stranded in the distance. The Darwin Star sat there useless, a mockery of their predicament. What? Thorne asked, sinking into a chair. Why would a reptile bite a rope? Mac turned from the window, his face grim in the lantern light. Maybe he didn't like the taste of the boat, or maybe, he paused, listening to the water lapping higher and higher against the floorboards. Maybe he wanted to make sure we stayed for dinner. Chapter 1 ends with the 4 of them standing in the center of the room, listening, not to the wind, not to the rain, but to the slow rhythmic scratching of claws climbing the pylons beneath them. The water was rising, and Barron was rising with it. 9:15 p.m. The darkness inside Station 4 was not the absence of light. It was a physical. The 4 survivors huddled in the center of the main room, illuminated by the harsh, hissing glow of a single propane lantern. Outside, the tropical storm had intensified into a whiteout of wind and rain, battering the corrugated iron walls with such ferocity that it felt like the shack was being sandblasted. But the humans inside weren't listening to the wind. They were listening to the floor. Every few minutes, a deep, resonant vibration traveled up through the ironwood pylons and shuddered through the soles of their boots. Thump, pause, thump. It wasn't the chaotic crashing of driftwood or debris caught in the current. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. It was the sound of 3,000 pounds of muscle and bone colliding with the structural supports of their sanctuary. He's testing the pylons, Mac whispered, his hand resting on the flare gun in his lap. He's looking for the rotten one. Thorne, pacing nervously near the radio table, shook his head. Don't be ridiculous, Mac. It's a reptile, not a structural engineer. It's probably just disoriented by the storm surge, bumping into things in the dark. Disoriented? Mac let out a dry, humorless laugh. He's lived in this river for 60 years. Doc, he knows where every stick is. He's doing this on purpose. He wants to see if we shake. As if to answer him, A massive blow struck the northeast corner of the shack. The entire structure groaned. A tin cup rattled off the table and rolled across the floorboards. Sarah let out a stifled sob, pulling her knees to her chest. This wasn't a random bump. The force required to shake a building elevated on 12-inch thick beams was immense. Barron wasn't just swimming into the posts, he was ramming them. Miller, the graduate student, was tasked with monitoring the water level. He lay flat on his stomach, shining a flashlight through a wide gap in the floorboards. "It's rising fast," he reported, his voice trembling. "I can see the water line on the pylons. It's maybe 2 feet below the joists now. The king tide is pushing everything up." The terrifying reality of their situation began to sink in. They were trapped in a wooden box, suspended over a rising ocean, and the ocean brought the monster with it. As the water level rose, the gap between the predator and the prey shrank. Barron didn't need to climb the pylons anymore. The ocean was building him an elevator. Thorne turned to the radio set, a heavy HF transceiver. He put the headset on, his fingers fumbling with the dials. "Mayday. This is Research Station 4. On Saltwater Creek. We have lost our vessel and are stranded. Immediate assistance required. Over." Static. A wall of white noise hissed back at him. The storm had scrambled the ionosphere, rendering the radio useless. Or perhaps the antenna on the roof had been damaged by the wind. Thorne tried again, his voice rising in pitch. "Mayday. Is anyone receiving? We have a hostile animal situation. We are taking on water." Nothing. Just the hiss of the empty airwaves. He slammed the headset down. "Atmospherics are dead. We're on our own until the storm passes." "Look at the floor," Sarah screamed, pointing to the corner of the room. They all turned. In the back corner of the shack, where the floorboards were slightly warped, a dark, glossy liquid was bubbling up between the cracks. It wasn't rain. It was thick, brown, and smelled of rot. The tide had breached the floor joists. The river was entering the house. It started as a trickle, a dark stain spreading across the dry wood. Then with a gurgle, it became a steady flow. The water brought with it the detritus of the swamp, leaves, silt, and tiny crabs, scuttling for high ground. The safe zone was shrinking. The floor, which had been their barrier against the world below, was now becoming part of the river. "Get on the tables," Mac ordered. "Get everything off the floor." They scrambled, moving the heavy equipment crates, the food and themselves, onto the sturdy wooden tables and the countertops. Within 20 minutes, the water inside the shack was ankle deep. It swirled around the furniture legs, black and opaque. The temperature in the room dropped. The humidity was suffocating. Mac stood on a chair, shining his light down into the dark water covering the floor. He knew the danger wasn't just structural. Crocodiles are ambush predators. They don't need deep water. They can hide in 12 inches of muddy slurry. If the door failed, or if a section of the floor gave way, Barron could glide into the room without making a ripple. "Turn off the lantern," Mac said suddenly. "What?" "No," Miller protested. "We need to see." "He can see our shadows," Mac hissed. "The light casts shadows through the cracks in the floor. He knows exactly where we are standing." "Turn it off." Thorne hesitated, then turned the valve. The hiss of the gas died, and the bright white light faded into an oppressive heavy grey darkness. Now, the only light came from the occasional flash of lighting outside, illuminating the room in strobe-like bursts. In the darkness, the sounds became amplified. Splosh, gurgle, the wind howling, and then a new sound, a scraping noise. It was coming from directly beneath the floorboards in the center of the room, right under the table where Sarah and Miller were crouching. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of osteoderms, the bony plates on a crocodile's back, grinding against the underside of the wood. He was right there, inches away, separated only by an inch of aging timber. "He's belly rubbing," Mac whispered in the dark. "He's floating pressed against the ceiling of the basement, which is our floor. He's trying to find a soft spot, a loose board." Sarah began to cry quiet. "He knows we're here. He can hear us breathing." "Shh," Mac signaled. Suddenly the scraping stopped. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then a massive explosion of force erupted from beneath. Crack. The floorboards under the table bowed upwards violently. Wood splintered. A rusty nail popped out and flew across the room. Barron had launched a vertical strike, ramming his snout into the wood from below with the force of a hydraulic press. Sarah screamed and scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of cans. The floor held barely, but the wood was cracked. A jet of water sprayed up through the new fracture like a geyser. "He's breaking in," Miller yelled, aiming his flashlight at the damage. "He cracked the beam. He's testing the tensile strength," Mac said, his voice grim. "He knows he can't bite through the pylons, so he's trying to punch through the floor." The water in the room was now calf deep. The furniture was floating. The shack groaned as the current outside pushed against. They were fighting a war on two fronts, the rising tide threatening to drown them, and the monster trying to breach their hull. "We need to reinforce that spot," Mac barked. "Grab the heavy equipment case, the battery box, put it over the crack." Thorn and Mac waded through the black water, struggling with the heavy lead-acid battery case. They slammed it down over the splintered floorboards, adding weight to hold the wood in place. As they stood there panting, knee-deep in the rising flood, they felt it again, a vibration. But this time it wasn't a strike, it was a slide. Something massive brushed past Mac's leg. He froze. The water was dark. He couldn't see anything below the surface, but the pressure wave was unmistakable. Was it a log, or had the beast found another way? "Nobody move," Mac whispered, drawing his hunting knife, the blade looking pathetically small in the gloom. "There's something in the water with us." A flash of lightning lit up the room. In the split second of illumination they saw it. The back door of the shack, the one leading to the small rear deck, was slightly ajar. The water had risen high enough to float the latch open, and sliding through the gap, silently, was a trail of bubbles. Baron wasn't under the floor anymore. He was in the kitchen. The realization that the predator was inside the room hit the four survivors with the force of a physical blow. The back door leading to the small scullery, and the rear deck, was swinging gently in the current. Through that black rectangle the storm raged. But the danger wasn't outside anymore. It was in the kitchen. Mac reacted first. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He froze, his body rigid, his flashlight beam fixed on the dark water, swirling through the doorway. "Get up high," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "Don't touch the water. Climb." The water in the main room was now knee-deep, a churning soup of mud, papers and debris. Thorn, Sarah and Miller were standing on the sturdy oak tables and the countertops, but even that elevation felt pathetically insufficient. A crocodile of Baron's size can launch itself vertically out of the water using the immense power of its tail. A table was not a fortress. It was a serving platter. "Where is he?" Sarah whimpered, pressing her back against the corrugated iron wall. "I can't see." That was the true horror of the situation. The water inside the shack was black, stained by the silt of the mangroves, and the spilled oil from a lantern. Baron could be lying completely submerged in 12 inches of water, invisible until he opened his mouth. The room was a minefield. Max swept his light across the kitchen floor. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating floating cans of beans, and a plastic bucket, drifting aimlessly. Then the light caught just past the threshold of the kitchen. Rising out of the black water like a jagged island was the ridge of a back. It was covered in osteoderms, bony plates that looked like ancient armor. The ridge kept rising and rising. It seemed to go on forever. The sheer mass of the animal in such a confined space was staggering. He took up the entire width of the kitchen. Baron stopped moving. He lay there, half submerged, his massive head resting on the threshold of the main room. He opened his eye. In the beam of the flashlight, the tapen lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina, flared a brilliant, demonic gold. He wasn't looking at the exit. He was looking at Miller, who was perched precariously on a filing cabinet near the radio. "He's blocking the door," Thorn said, his voice trembling with a scientific detachment that masked pure terror. "He's cornering us." "He's not cornering," Max said, shifting his grip on the knife. "He's selecting." Suddenly the shack shuddered violently. Baron didn't lunge. He thrashed. He swung his massive tail inside the kitchen, smashing it against a stove and the wooden cupboards. The sound was like a car crash. Metal crumpled, wood splintered. The violence was calculated. He was widening the doorway. He was breaking down the partition wall to get into the main room. With a deafening crack, the door frame gave way. Baron surged forward into the main living area. The water displacement caused a mini tsunami inside the room, knocking over chairs and sending a wave washing over Mac's boots. "Up! Get to the rafters!" Mac roared. The shack had an exposed ceiling structure, heavy hardwood beams that supported the tin roof, about 8 feet off the floor. It was their only hope. Miller scrambled up the filing cabinet, reaching for the crossbeam. He hooked his fingers over the rough wood and pulled himself up, swinging his legs wildly to avoid the water. Sarah climbed onto the counter, stepped on the sink, and hauled herself up into the eaves, sobbing uncontrollably. Thorn was slower. He was an older man, heavy. He stood on the central table, reaching for the beam, but he couldn't get a grip. Baron saw the movement. The reptile didn't run. He exploded. The acceleration of a saltwater crocodile is blindingly fast. Over short distance, he launched himself through the water, smashing into the heavy oak table Thorn was standing on. The table didn't just tip over, it disintegrated under the impact of 1,000 pounds of kinetic energy. Thorn fell. He hit the black water with a splash that echoed like a gunshot. For a second he was gone, submerged in the muck. Elias, Sarah screamed from the rafters. Mac perched on a high shelf near the door. Didn't think, he acted. He pointed the flare gun, not at the crocodile, but at the water just in front of its nose, and pulled the trigger. Whoosh.
The magnesium flare ignited with a blinding red brilliance, sizzling and popping as it hit the water. The sudden explosion of light and heat startled the beast. Baron flinched, snapping his jaws shut on empty air, the sound like two bricks being clapped together. The heat of the flare confused his sensory pits. That split second of confusion saved Elias Thorne's life. He surfaced, sputtering, eyes wide with the realization of death. He scrambled frantically onto a floating crate, and then clawed his way up a bookshelf. Mac reached down from the shelf, grabbed Thorne by the collar of his shirt, and hauled him up just as Baron lunged again. The jaws slammed shut on the bookshelf, shearing through the solid wood, as if it were balsa. Books and papers flew into the air, but Thorne was out of reach, hanging from the rafter, gasping for air, his legs dangling 2 feet above the snapping teeth. With a final heave, the group pulled Thorne up onto the beams. They lay there draped over the dusty, spider-infested wood, looking down. The flare flickered and died, plunging the room back into semi-darkness. The silence returned, but it was a heavy breathing silence. Below them, the floor of their research station belonged to the Baron. The water was now thigh-deep. The crocodile cruised slowly around the perimeter of the room, knocking over the remaining furniture. He was exploring his new territory. He swam under the spot where they were hiding, his tail brushing against the walls. From their vantage point in the rafters, the humans were helpless. They were trapped in the crawl space of the roof, breathing the hot, stale air, trapped against the tin ceiling. Below them, the flashlight beams cut through the dark water, illuminating the pale belly of the monster as he rolled and turned. "He's not leaving," Miller whispered, wiping slime from his face. "He knows we're up here. He's waiting for us to fall." Mac looked at his watch. It was only 10:30 p.m. The tide wouldn't peak for another 3 hours. The water was still rising. As they watched, the water level crept up the walls, covering the electrical outlets, then the window sills. Every inch the water rose, brought Baron closer to the rafters. He's going to wait for the tide, Mac realized, the horror of the strategy dawning on him. He doesn't have to jump, he just has to wait for the ocean to lift him up to us. Then a sound came from the darkness below that chilled them more than the attack. It was a low, guttural growl, vibrating through the shack's frame. But it wasn't aggression. It sounded almost like a purr. Baron had found the food supplies. He had found the crate of canned beef, and the cooler of meat. They listened in the dark as the beast tore into the metal cans with his teeth, crunching through the aluminum to get to the food. He was eating their supplies. He was fueling up. The siege had truly begun. They were wet, injured, trapped in the ceiling, and the water was rising, and below them the landlord had come to collect. Chapter 2 ends with the camera looking down from the rafters. The humans are silhouettes clinging to the beams. Below, the entire floor is a lake of black water, and in the center, looking straight up with glowing yellow eyes, is Baron, waiting. Midnight in the Adelaide River Delta. The storm outside had passed its peak, reducing the torrential rain to a steady, monotonous drumming on the corrugated iron roof. But inside Station 4, the atmosphere was suffocating. The 4 survivors, Mac,
Dr. Thorne, Sarah, and Miller were clinging to the hardwood rafters of the shack, like spiders escaping a flood. Their muscles burned with lactic acid. Their hands were cramped claws, gripping the rough, dusty wood of the beams. Below them, the floor of the research station had ceased to exist. It was a black lake, churning slowly with the current of the tide, and patrolling that lake was the landlord. Barron did not frenzy. He did not thrash. He possessed the terrifying patience of a creature that has outlived the dinosaurs. He spent the hours between midnight and 3:00 a.m., simply floating. Every now and then a flashlight beam would catch the top of his head, a jagged island of bone and scar tissue breaking the surface. He was conserving oxygen. He was conserving heat. He knew that his prey had nowhere to go. They were trapped in a wooden cage, and the water was lifting him up to meet them. The water level continued to rise, driven by the relentless push of the king tide and the storm surge. It crept up the walls, swallowing the electrical sockets, the window sills and the tops of the ruined bookshelves. At 1:30 a.m., the water was only 3 feet below the rafters. This proximity changed the dynamic of the siege. Barron didn't need to jump anymore. He could simply lift his head out of the water and snap. At one point, Miller's boot, dangling slightly lower than the others, brushed against something wet in the darkness. He recoiled with a gasp, pulling his legs up to his chin. A second later, the sound of jaws slamming shut, clack, echoed through the rafters. The beast had snapped at the shadow of the foot. It was a warning shot. "Keep your legs up, Mac," hissed, his voice dry and ragged. "He's measuring the distance." The psychological toll of the siege began to fracture the group. Sarah was shivering uncontrollably, not just from fear, but from the damp cold rising from the water. Dr. Thorne, the man of science, stared blankly at the dark water, muttering about tidal charts and predator biomass. He was trying to rationalize a situation that defied logic. He had spent his life studying these animals, classifying them as instinct-driven reptiles. But looking down at the gold eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, he saw something that wasn't in the textbooks. He saw malice. He saw a creature that had effectively cut their escape line and was now running out the clock. The smell in the rafters became overpowering. It was a mix of swamp gas, spilled gasoline from the generator, and the musky reptilian odor of the crocodile itself. It was the smell of a prehistoric era. Around 2:00 a.m., the shack groaned. The water pressure against the outer walls was immense. The entire structure shifted on its pylons, leaning precariously to the left. For a terrifying moment, they thought the pylons would snap, dropping the entire roof into the water. If the roof fell, they would be trapped under the tin sheets with the beast. It would be a massacre in a sardine can. But the ironwood held. The shack settled, groaning like a dying Mac checked his watch every 10 minutes. He knew the tides. High tide was predicted for 2:45 a.m. After that, gravity would win, and the water would begin to recede. They just had to survive the crest. But the crest brought the water agonizingly close. At the peak of the tide, the black surface was a mere 18 inches from the beams. Barron was so close, they could hear him inhaling. The sound was a wet, raspy rattle, like air being sucked through a broken pipe. He drifted directly under Sarah. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out, refusing to look down. She knew that if she slipped, if her grip failed for just 1 second, she would be pulled under before anyone could grab her. The crocodile seemed to sense the peak of the tide. He became more active. He bumped against the walls. He thrashed his tail, sending waves splashing up onto the beams, soaking the survivors. He was frustrated. The food was right there, just out of reach. He launched a sudden vertical lunge at Mac, exploding out of the water. Mac kicked out instinctively, his heavy boot connecting with the reptile's snout. The impact was like kicking a concrete wall. Barron fell back with a splash that soaked them all. But the aggression was clear. He wasn't waiting anymore. He was testing the range. "Hold on," Mac roared. "Just hold on. The tide has to turn." And then, as if by a miracle of physics, the water stopped rising. For 20 minutes it held steady, a dark mirror, reflecting their terrified faces. Then slowly, Painfully slowly, a wet line appeared on the wall. An inch of wood was revealed, then 2 inches. The tide had turned. The ocean was retreating, but the retreat brought a new horror. As the water lowered, it didn't leave a clean floor. It left a layer of thick, clinging mud and debris inside the shack, and it raised the question where was Barry. As the water level dropped to waist height, the crocodile was no longer visible on the surface. He had submerged. Was he still in the room, or had he swum out the broken door with the receding tide? The hours before dawn were the longest. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. They couldn't climb down. The room below was a dark pool of unknown depth. They had to wait for the sun. They had to wait for light to reveal if they were alone, or if the landlord was lying in the mud, waiting for them to descend. As the grey light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the roof, the devastation became visible. The shack was wrecked. Furniture was smashed. Equipment was gone. The water was gone, leaving behind a slick, black sludge covering the floor. But the room appeared empty. The massive shape of the crocodile was nowhere to be seen. "He's gone," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "Maybe," Mac said, pulling the flare gun. "He had 1 shell left. Or maybe he's just under the mud." The siege had entered its final phase. They had survived the night. Now they had to survive the escape. The hours between 3:07 a.m. and dawn were a test of endurance that blurred the line between physical pain and psychological collapse. The king tide had receded, pulling the ocean back out of the shack, but it did not leave a clean space behind. It left a disaster zone. As the water level dropped, it revealed a floor coated in 6 inches of thick, black mangrove silt. The smell was atrocious, a concentrated stench of rotting vegetation, primeval mud, and the metallic tang of fear. High in the rafters, the 4 survivors were reaching their breaking point. Their arms were trembling uncontrollably, muscles burning with lactic acid. Their fingers were locked into rigid claws cramped from hours of gripping the rough hardwood beam. Sarah was slipping in and out of consciousness, her head resting against a dusty joist, muttering about the cold. Dr. Thorne and Mac locked eyes in the gloom, communicating without words. They knew the reality. If anyone fell now, they would drop into a dark, semi-drained room, where a 23-foot monster could be hiding in 12 inches of slurry. Mac kept his eyes fixed on the mud below. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush predators. They are masters of stillness. Baron could have swum out with the tide, returning to the river channel, or he could have simply sunk to the bottom of the room, burying himself in the silt, becoming invisible. He could be waiting right under their boot. By 5:30 a.m., the first grey, sickly light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the corrugated iron walls. It revealed a room that was empty of water, but filled with shadows. The silence was absolute. The storm had passed, leaving a vacuum of sound that felt heavy and threatening. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. "We have to go down," Mac whispered, his voice raspy from dehydration. "Sarah is going to fall. We can't stay up here another hour." Thorne nodded, looking at the slick black mud below. It was a drop of about 8 feet. "I'll go first," Mac announced. He holstered the flare gun, though he knew he had only 1 shell left. He drew his hunting knife, a 6-inch blade that seemed pathetically small against a dinosaur. "Stay on the beams until I clear the room." He lowered himself slowly, hanging by his arms to reduce the distance. His boots dangled inches above the dark sludge. He took a breath, closed his eyes for a split second, and dropped. The sound of his landing was sickeningly loud in the silence. A wet, heavy splash. Mac landed in a crouch, spinning instantly to cover his blind spots. The mud sucked at his boots, anchoring him to the floor. He swept the room with his eyes, the knife shaking slightly in his hand. A smashed chair lay in the corner. A floating cooler drifted against the wall. The dark cavern of the kitchen gaped open like a mouth. Nothing moved. The mud remained undisturbed. Clear. Mac exhaled, though he didn't lower the knife. "Come down one by one. Watch your step. The floor is slick as grease." Dr. Thorne dropped next, landing heavily and slipping, his hands plunging into the muck to steady himself. He recoiled as if burned, terrified of what his fingers might touch. Then Miller. Finally they had to coax Sarah down. Mac caught her as she fell, preventing her from crashing into the debris. They stood back to back in the center of the ruined room, shivering, covered in filth. They were alive. They were on solid ground. But the relief was instantly replaced by the realization of their predicament. The shack was wrecked. The radio equipment was gone, dragged into the swamp, and the Darwin Star, their only ticket home, was not at the jetty. They moved as a unit towards the front door, which hung off its hinges. Mac kicked it open, revealing the landscape of the delta in the harsh morning light. The view was bleak. The tide was fully out. The river was a narrow brown ribbon, winding through a vast expanse of exposed grey mudflats. And there, 100 yards away, was the boat. The Darwin Star had been pushed by the wind and the high water onto a mudbank on the opposite side of the channel. It was tilted at a 45-degree angle, high and dry. It looked intact. It was reachable, but between the safety of the station's pylons and the boat lay 100 yards of exposed soft mud. Thorne stared at the distance. It looked like a mud. In this mud, that is a 10-minute slog, he calculated. We will be completely exposed. We don't have a choice, Mac replied, scanning the tree line. The tide turns in 3 hours. If we don't get that boat into the water before the level rises again, we are stuck here for another cycle, and I don't think the shack will survive another high tide. If the water comes back, Baron comes back. Mac walked to the edge of the jetty and knelt down. He pulled up the end of the mooring line, the rope that had started this nightmare. In the daylight, the damage was undeniable. The end wasn't just broken. It was frayed, crushed and matted with green slime. He held it up for Thorne to see. Look at the pattern, Mac said quietly. He didn't just bite it. He ground it. He worked on this rope until it snapped. He knew exactly what this line did.
Thorne stared at the severed rope. As a scientist, everything he knew about reptilian intelligence told him to reject the idea. Animals act on instinct. They don't understand mechanics. They don't understand sabotage. But the evidence was in his hand. The crocodile had disarmed them. It was a tactical maneuver. Where is he? Sarah asked, her voice thin and terrified, scanning the dense mangroves that lined the riverbank. He's watching, Mac said. Always watching. They gathered what little supplies they could scavenge, a few cans of water, a first aid kit. They stood at the edge of the ladder, looking down. The bottom rung was buried in the mud. To get to the boat, they would have to step off the structure and enter the kill zone. Formation, Mac ordered. I take point. Thorne, you take the rear. Miller, Sarah in the middle. If you see anything move, a log, a ripple, a shadow, you scream. Mac stepped off the ladder. He sank up to his knees instantly. The mud of the Adelaide River is not like sand. It is like glue. It creates a suction that fights every step. Suck, pop, suck, pop. The noise of their movement was incredibly loud in the silence. They were leaving the fortress. They were entering the arena, and somewhere in that vast expanse of grey mud and brown water, the Baron was waiting for the game to resume. The sun had fully risen now, burning off the last wisps of storm clouds, but bringing no comfort. It transformed the Adelaide River Delta into a blinding landscape of grey mirrors and heat haze. The 4 survivors stood at the base of the station's ladder, knee-deep in the clinging black ooze. Ahead of them lay 100 yards of open ground, to a person standing on dry land. 100 yards is a dash, a matter of seconds, but in the mangrove mud, distance is measured in effort, not time. This wasn't just a walk. It was a slow-motion struggle against a substrate that wanted to hold them in place, and somewhere in that landscape, a 23-foot predator was perfectly camouflaged. Keep your spacing, Mac ordered, his voice tight, 10 feet apart. Don't bunch up. If he attacks, he can only take one of us. The rest keep moving to the boat. It was a brutal, pragmatic calculation, but Dr. Thorne nodded. He understood the biology of the situation. They were stepping into the kill zone. They pushed off from the safety of the pylons. The sound of their movement was wet and rhythmic. Squelch, suck, pop. Every step required them to pull their legs free from the suction of the mud. It was exhausting work. Within 20 yards, their breathing was heavy, amplified by the absolute silence of the swamp. Sarah was in the middle of the line, clutching a waterproof case to her chest. She kept her eyes fixed on Mac's back, refusing to look at the deep channel of the river to her left. She knew that the drop-off into the main channel was steep. If Baron launched from that deep water,
They would have zero reaction time, but the river surface remained glassy and undisturbed. It was the mud flats themselves that felt wrong. The topography was uneven, full of dips, hollows and stranded logs, left by the receding tide. Any one of those logs could be a spine. Any one of those hollows could be a trap. They reached the halfway point. 50 yards from the shack, 50 yards from the stranded Darwin Star. The heat was already oppressive, the humidity rising from the drying mud like steam. Miller, who was walking behind Sarah, suddenly stopped. "Wait," he whispered. The line halted. Mac turned slowly, sweat dripping from his nose. "What?" "I heard a hiss," Miller said, his eyes darting to a patch of debris to their right, like a tire leaking air. They froze. The silence returned, heavy and thick. Mac scanned the area Miller was pointing to. It was a cluster of mangrove roots and driftwood about 30 feet away. It looked innocuous, but as they watched, a small bubble of mud popped on the surface. "Blah, it's just swamp gas," Thorne said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Methane releasing from the decomposition." "Move," Mac commanded, but he shifted his grip on the knife. "Pick up the pace." They trudged forward, the mud seemingly getting deeper, dragging at their thighs. They were 40 yards from the boat now. They could see the scratches on the aluminum hull clearly. They could see the registration numbers painted on the side. The promise of safety was tantalizing, and then the trap was sprung. It didn't come from the deep river channel. It didn't come from the tree line. It came from the path ahead, 30 feet in front of Mac, directly between the group and the boat. The mud began to heave. It wasn't a sudden splash. It was a tectonic shift. A section of the mud flat, the size of a station wagon, began to rise. The grey slime sluiced off the back of the beast, revealing the black scarred armor of the Baron. He hadn't swum away. He hadn't hidden in the deep water. He had buried himself in the shallows during the falling tide, somehow knowing, that they would have to cross this exact stretch of ground to reach the vessel. The camouflage was perfect until he moved. He was just part of the geography. "Back!" Mac screamed, stumbling backward. "Get back!" Baron didn't just emerge. He exploded into motion. On land, crocodiles are often thought of as sluggish. This is a fatal misconception. For short distances, a large saltwater crocodile can high walk, lifting its body completely off the ground, and galloping at speeds of up to 10 miles per hour. In the slick mud, he was faster than any human. The beast roared, a sound like a chainsaw cutting through wet wood, and he wasn't aiming for Mac, who was closest. He ignored the guide entirely. He swerved past him, his massive tail knocking Mac sideways into the muck. Baron was targeting the center of the line. He was targeting Sarah. The chaos was absolute. Sarah tried to run, but the mud betrayed her. She slipped, falling face first into the black slime. She screamed, scrambling to turn over, wiping the mud from her eyes. When she opened them, the nightmare was filling her vision. The crocodile was 10 yards away, closing the distance with terrifying speed, his jaws gaping open to reveal the pale pink gullet and the rows of conical teeth. "Sarah," Miller lunged forward, grabbing her backpack straps and hauling her backwards. The movement threw them both off balance, and they tumbled into a shallow depression. Baron lunged. His jaws slammed shut on the space where Sarah had been a second earlier. The sound of the bite was a deafening clack, like two stones striking together. He missed her leg by inch. The momentum of his charge carried him past them, his massive body sliding over the mud like a sled. Mac was back on his feet. He had no gun. He had no flare. He had a knife and a desperate rage. He knew he couldn't kill the dinosaur, but he had to distract it. He grabbed a heavy piece of driftwood, a soaked ironwood branch, and charged the beast from behind. He slammed the wood onto the crocodile's sensitive tail base. Baron whipped around with a speed that defied physics. His head snapped back, his jaws snapping at Mac. Mac threw himself flat in the mud to avoid the bite. The crocodile hissed, a sound like a steam valve opening, and turned his massive body to face the scattered group. He was now positioned between them and the station. He had cut off their retreat. The only way forward was the boat. "Run for the boat," Mac bellowed, scrambling up. "Don't look back. Go." They ran. It was a clumsy nightmare run, legs pumping through the thick sludge, lungs burning. Thorne grabbed Sarah. Miller grabbed the medical kit, and they sprinted for the Darwin Star. Baron recovered instantly. He turned and gave chase. It was a race for survival. Across 30 yards of open mud, the humans had a head start. But the crocodile had the terrain. He gained on them with every stride. Miller reached the boat first. The aluminum hull was tilted high, the gunwale about 5 feet off the ground. He vaulted up, grabbing the rail and hauling himself over. He turned back, reaching down. "Give me your hand." Sarah scrambled up the side, slipping on the algae-covered metal. Miller grabbed her wrist and pulled. She tumbled onto the deck just as Baron's snout smashed into the side of the hull directly below her. The boat shook violently, the metal groaning under the impact. Thorne was next, breathless, his face gray. He clawed his way up the ladder at the stern. Mac was the last. He was 10 feet behind, and the Baron was right on his heels. Mac didn't climb. He dove. He launched himself at the transom of the boat. Grabbing the outboard motor housing, he pulled his legs up. Just as Baron snapped, the jaws closed on the rubber heel of Mac's boot, tearing it clean off. Mac kicked free, scrambling over the engine cowling, and falling onto the metal deck of the boat. They lay there for a moment, gasping, chests heaving, hearts hammering a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They were covered in black mud, shaking from adrenaline shock. They were in the boat, but the safety was an illusion. A heavy thud shook the vessel, then another. The boat rocked violently. Baron hadn't stopped. He was ramming the boat. He was using his massive head to batter the aluminum hull. The Darwin Star was a sturdy craft, but it wasn't a tank. It sat precariously on the mud bank. With each blow, the boat shifted slightly. "He's trying to knock us off the bank." Thorne realized horror dawning on him. "If he pushes us into the deeper water, he can't." Mac gasped, checking his foot where the boot heel used to be. "We're grounded too hard." The attack stopped. Silence returned to the delta. Slowly, carefully, Mac stood up and peered over the gunwale. The sight that met him chilled his blood. Baron was lying in the mud, parallel to the boat, less than 5 feet away. He wasn't trying to climb the slippery metal sides. He was simply watching. His yellow eyes were fixed on Mac. He opened his mouth slightly, venting heat, revealing the rows of teeth that had almost ended them. The crocodile settled into the mud. He closed his eyes to sleep. He was resuming his weight. "He knows," Mac whispered, sliding back down to the deck floor. "Knows what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "He knows the tide is coming back," Mac said. He looked at the sky. The sun was climbing higher. "We are high and dry right now, but in 3 hours the water comes back, and when the water rises, it will lift this boat. But before it lifts the boat," he didn't have to finish the sentence. Thorne understood. Before the water got deep enough to float the heavy vessel, it would get deep enough to allow Baron to swim right up to the gunwale. The 5-foot height advantage they had now would vanish. When the tide rose, the monster would be at eye level. They were trapped in an aluminum bowl, baking under the Australian sun, with no radio, no weapon, and a monster guarding the only exit. The siege had moved from the shack to the boat, and this time, there were no rafters to climb. Miller tried the ignition key. The engine turned over. Chug, chug, chug. But didn't catch. He tried again. Chug, chug, chug. Silence. Fuel line. Mac diagnosed instantly. "The angle. The fuel tank is tilted. The intake is sucking air. Can we fix it?" Thorne asked. "Not without leveling the boat," Mac said. "And we can't level the boat until the water lifts us." So they sat. The sun beat down on the metal deck, turning the boat into an oven. The mud around them began to bake and crack, and 5 feet away, the Baron waited. He didn't move a muscle. He was a statue of prehistoric patience. He knew the schedule of the ocean better than they did. He knew that the water was coming, and he knew that when it arrived, the game would enter its final bloody...
The sun reached its zenith at noon, turning the aluminum hull of the Darwin Star into a griddle. The temperature on the exposed deck soared past 45 degrees Celsius. The 4 survivors huddled under a makeshift tarp they had rigged using a torn piece of canvas and 2 fishing rods, but it offered little relief from the suffocating heat. They were dehydrated, covered in drying mud that cracked on their skin like scales, and trapped in a stalemate that was slowly killing them. 5 feet away, lying parallel to the boat in the baking mud, lay the Baron. He hadn't moved an inch in 2 hours. He didn't need to. He was a reptile. He absorbed the heat, charging his metabolism like a solar battery. He kept his eyes open, the vertical slits fixed on the gunwale of the boat. He was waiting for the only ally he needed, the ocean. Around 12:30 p.m., the sound returned. It started as a distant whisper, then grew into a steady hiss. The tide was turning. The water was coming back to the Adelaide River delta. It didn't arrive as a wave, but as a creeping stain. The grey mud around the boat began to glisten. Then, small rivulets of brown water snaked through the cracks in the dry earth. The water encircled the boat. Then the crocodile, Baron, floated before the boat did. As the water depth reached 12 inches, the massive reptile became buoyant. He shifted his weight, sliding effortlessly closer to the hull. Inside the boat, Mac was working frantically on the Yamaha outboard engine. He had taken the cowling off, exposing the hot machinery. The problem was simple physics. The boat was tilted at a steep 45-degree angle on the mudbank. The fuel tank intake was on the high side, sucking air instead of gasoline. Until the boat floated and leveled out. The engine was dead weight, waters hitting the transom. Miller reported, peering over the stern. It's rising fast. Good. Mac grunted, sweat dripping onto the spark plugs. We need about 2 feet of depth to float her off the bank. But as soon as she floats, we drift, and if the engine doesn't catch immediately, the current pushes us back into the mangroves. Or into him, Sarah whispered. Baron was now swimming. The water was deep enough to cover his body, leaving only his head and the jagged ridges of his back visible. He circled the boat slowly, testing the perimeter. He bumped the aluminum hull with his snout. Thud. The sound reverberated through the metal, vibrating against the survivor's ribs. He's checking for weak spots, Thorne said, clutching a heavy boat hook, a long pole with a metal tip used for docking. It was their only weapon. As the water level rose, the distance between the crocodile and the gunwale shrank. When they had climbed in, the rail was 5 feet above the mud. Now, with the water rising, the rail was only 2 feet above the surface. Baron drifted closer. He lifted his head out of the water, resting his chin on the metal rail of the boat. He hissed, a low guttural exhalation that smelled of rotten meat. He was looking directly at Sarah, who was sitting near the center console. Get back, Mac yelled, center of the boat. Keep the weight in the middle. Baron lunged. He didn't try to jump over the rail. He tried to pull the boat down. He clamped his jaws onto the aluminum gunwale and rolled. The metal shrieked as teeth punched through it. The entire boat lurched violently to the port side, dipping the rail towards the water. Hit him, Max screamed, still wrenching on the fuel line. Don't let him capsize us. Thorne swung the boat hook with all his remaining strength, driving the metal tip into the crocodile's thick neck armor. It bounced off harmlessly. Miller grabbed an aluminum oar and stabbed at the beast's eye. The blade connected. Baron roared, a muffled, wet sound, and released the boat, sliding back into the murky water. The boat rocked wildly, taking on gallons of water over the side. Bail, Thorne shouted. Get the water out. He's coming back, Sarah screamed. Baron had circled around the bow. He launched a second attack, this time targeting the stern where Mac was working. The beast exploded out of the water, his jaws snapping inches from the engine. He bit the cowling of the motor, cracking the plastic casing. Mac kicked out, his boot connecting with the reptile's snout, sending him stumbling back against the center console. The primer, Mac yelled to Miller. Squeeze the fuel bulb. Now. Miller scrambled to the fuel tank, squeezing the rubber primer bulb frantically until it went hard. It's prime. The boat was floating now. The tide had lifted them off the mud bank.
but without power they were drifting helpless in the current, spinning slowly in circles. Baron sensed the vulnerability. He's submerged. Where is he? Thorn yelled, scanning the brown water. I lost him. A massive impact struck the bottom of the boat. The aluminum hull boomed like a drum. Baron was attacking from below, ramming the keel. He was trying to flip them. The boat tipped, dangerously, throwing Sarah and Miller to the floor. Water sloshed over the transom. Mac pulled the starter cord. The engine coughed and died. Come on, Mac roared, pulling again. His shoulder burned with the effort. Rod, 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 put, die. He's coming over the side. Baron resurfaced on the starboard side. He hooked his massive front claws over the gunwale and began to haul his bulk up. The weight of the 2,000-pound animal tilted the boat sharply. Water poured in. The boat was seconds from capsizing. Thorn charged. He abandoned the boat hook and grabbed the flare gun box. A heavy steel case. He slammed it down onto the crocodile's claws, smashing his fingers against the metal rail. Baron didn't let go. He opened his jaws and snapped at Thorn's face, missing by inches. Start the damn engine. Thorn screamed, falling back. Mac braced his foot against the transom, wrapped both hands around the pull cord, and screamed with exertion. He pulled with everything he had left. Rod, the 40-horsepower Yamaha engine, didn't just start. It screamed to life in high idle. Blue smoke erupted from the exhaust. Hold on. Mac slammed the gear lever into forward and twisted the throttle to the max. The propeller bit into the water. The boat surged forward with a violent jerk. The sudden acceleration caught Baron off guard. As the boat leaped forward, the crocodile lost his grip on the gunwale. He slid backward, his claws screeching down the side of the aluminum, leaving deep gouges in the metal. He fell back into the wake with a massive splash. Mac didn't throttle back. He steered the boat wildly, toward the center of the river channel. The bow, slamming into the chop of the incoming tide. The wind whipped their faces. The engine roared a beautiful mechanical song of salvation. Miller and Sarah scrambled to the stern. Looking back, behind them in the frothing white wake of the boat, a dark shape broke the surface. Baron was swimming after them. He was fast, terrifyingly fast. His tail thrashed the water, propelling him forward in a wake-up pursuit. For 100 yards, it looked like he might catch them, but the machine was stronger than the beast. The Darwin Star picked up speed, planing over the water. Widening the gap, the dark shape of the monster grew smaller and smaller, until it was just a ripple in the brown water of the delta. Mac kept the throttle pinned until the temperature gauge on the engine redlined. He didn't care. He navigated the twisting turns of Saltwater Creek with the reflexes of a man possessed, cutting corners, bouncing off mud banks, desperate to reach the open water of the Adelaide River. 10 minutes later, the narrow, suffocating walls of the mangroves opened up. The wide, expansive blue of the main river channel lay before them. They saw a fishing trawler in the distance. They saw civilization. Mac finally throttled back, bringing the boat to a slow chug. The engine idled smoothly, oblivious to the violence it had just survived. The 4 survivors sat in silence. They were soaked, bruised, bleeding, and covered in mud. The boat was half full of water. The gunwales were punctured with tooth holes. The plastic engine cover was shattered. Thorn looked at his hands. They were shaking so badly he couldn't make a fist. He looked at Mac, who was staring back at the mouth of the creek. He stopped chasing. Miller said, his voice hollow. He didn't need to chase. Mac replied, spitting blood from a split lip. He made his point. They drifted, in the main channel, the adrenaline crash hitting them like a physical blow. Sarah began to weep softly, the sound mixing with the rhythmic chugging of the motor. They touched the holes in the metal side of the boat. the physical proof that it wasn't a hallucination. The metal was bent inward. The power required to punch through marine-grade aluminum was unfathomable. Max steered the boat toward the distant trawler, but his eyes kept flicking to the depth sounder. He would never trust the water again. Back in the mangroves, the tide continued to rise. It flooded the ruined Station 4, washing away the mud and the blood. It covered the pylons where they had hidden. It reclaimed the territory. And deep in the murky water of Saltwater Creek, the Baron sank slowly to the bottom. He settled into the silt, closing his transparent third eyelids. He was patient. He had held the territory for 60 years. The intruders were gone. The silence returned. He would wait for the next boat. The rescue of the Darwin Star crew was officially recorded in the logbooks of the Northern Territory Police. At 2:15 p.m., when the fishing trawler, Arafora Queen, pulled alongside the battered aluminum runabout, the captain reported that the 4 survivors were in a state of catatonic shock. They were dehydrated, covered in drying mud, and suffering from exposure. But it was the condition of their boat that silenced the authorities. The Darwin Star was towed back to the marina in Darwin, where it became an object of grim fascination. The hull looked as though it had been worked over with a sledgehammer. There were deep concave dents in the reinforced aluminum plating, where the Baron had rammed the vessel. Along the gunwales, punched clean through the metal, were rows of puncture marks. The spacing of the holes measured over 20 inches wide, forensic proof of the sheer size of the predator. But the most chilling piece of evidence was not the boat. It was the coil of rope Mac had refused to let go of. He handed the severed mooring line to the police sergeant. It wasn't just a piece of hemp. It was the smoking gun. The frayed end showed clear patterns of crushing and grinding. It hadn't snapped under tension. It hadn't chafed against a rock. It had been systematically chewed until failure. This piece of rope challenged everything the local biologists thought they knew about reptilian behavior. It suggested that Crocodilus porosus possesses a level of problem-solving intelligence that we are only just beginning to understand. As for Research Station 4, its fate was sealed. The mining company that owned the lease sent a survey team out a week later to assess the damage. They found the shack standing, but only just. The pylons on the northeast corner had been loosened by the repeated battering ram attacks of the Crocodile. The interior was a wreck of mud and mold, deeming the location structurally unsound and ecologically hostile. The company ordered it abandoned. They didn't even bother to dismantle it. They left it to the swamp. Over the years, the termites and the rot took hold, and eventually the station collapsed into the river. Today, if you navigate Saltwater Creek, all you will see are a few rusted ironwood stumps jutting out of the mud at low tide. The tombstones of a failed siege. The survivors drifted apart, bound by a trauma they wished to forget. Dr. Elias Thorne, the man who had dedicated his life to studying reptiles, never returned to the field. He published a dry academic paper on aggressive territorial defense in large saurians, but he stripped out the details of the rope and the siege, perhaps fearing ridicule from the scientific community. He spent the rest of his career in lecture halls, far away from the tidal zone. Sarah and Miller left the program entirely. It is said that Sarah moved to Melbourne, as far south as she could get, to a city where the water is too cold for monsters. Only Mac remained in the territory. He continued to work the rivers, but he stopped guiding tourists into the deep mangroves. He became a superstitious man, obsessively checking his knots, never turning off his engine in deep water. In the fishing pubs of Darwin, after a few beers, he would tell the story. He would talk about the eyes that knew. He maintained until his dying day that Baron wasn't just hungry. He was offended by their presence. And what of the Baron? The massive crocodile was never caught. The Department of Parks and Wildlife launched a targeted trapping program in the Adelaide River Delta in 1985, hoping to relocate the problem animal. They set heavy steel cage traps, baited with wild boar. They caught several large males, some reaching 16 feet, but they never caught a 23-footer with a white scar across his snout. The Baron simply vanished, or, more likely, he learned, if he was smart enough to cut a rope. He was certainly smart enough to recognize a trap. Reports continue to filter in over the decades, fishermen finding their crab pots crushed, houseboat owners reporting strange, rhythmic bumping against their hulls in the night. The legend grew. He became the ghost of the Delta, the king who could not be dethroned. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about our place in the natural order. We like to think of nature as a chaotic, instinct-driven force. We categorize animals as simple biological machines. Eat, sleep, reproduce. It makes us feel safe. It makes us feel superior. But the events of 1984 suggest a darker reality. The Baron cut the escape route. He tested the perimeter defenses. He used the weather and the tides as weapons. He laid a trap in the mud and waited for hours. That is not instinct. That is strategy. It implies a mind that is calculating, patient, and capable of holding a grudge. We spend our lives building walls, inventing lights, and crafting aluminum boats, believing these things separate us from the food chain. But out there, in the deep black water, where the satellite signal fades, there are creatures that have been perfecting the art of the ambush for 200 million years. We have watches. They have time. We have technology. They have patience. So, the next time you are near the water's edge, and you see a log floating against the current, look closely. It might just be driftwood, or it might be a general waiting for you to make a mistake. This brings our investigation of the Adelaide River siege to a close. But now, I want to turn it over to you, the jury. Do you believe the cutting of the rope was a deliberate act of sabotage by a hyper-intelligent animal, or was it a terrifying coincidence of nature? Can a reptile truly plan a siege? Leave your theory in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story of survival, isolation, and primal fear kept you on the edge of your seat, you have found your tribe. This channel is dedicated to the dark corners of history and nature that others ignore. But to survive what comes next, you need to be prepared. Make sure you are subscribed and have the notification bell turned on, because next week, we are leaving the heat of the swamp for the freezing snow-blind taiga of Siberia. We are going to investigate a pack of wolves that didn't fear fire, didn't fear bullets, and hunted a team of geologists, not for food, but for sport. The ghost pack of the Urals is next. Until then, check your knots and stay out of the water.